People have asked me many times if there are any influences on the way I made this picture, and in some cases, other films that were successful. They don't ask you about the ones that aren't successful. And I've always had to say, no, I had no influence. Of course I did. To most people who are directing films, they have served what they consider to be an apprenticeship of working with other people that are good, an apprenticeship of learning by watching, an apprenticeship by seeing films even if you aren't seeing them made, and so on. The few exceptions to this are writers who have become directors. They have sat in that traditional lonely room with that traditional blank page and just sweated it out from there. Most other people have learned from watching. So I suppose I was influenced. I suppose knowing George Stevens well, watching his work, knowing Jack Ford, watching his, but I was not consciously influenced. I simply daydream a picture. Like most directors I know, they read a script and they can shut their eyes and see that film, believe it or not. They know what it should look like, or rather I should say what they want it to look like. They know where it should be and what it should be. Now then, the thing to do, try to be able to get that, which you can't always, and having gotten it, hope that you were right in having picked it. A lot of people have asked me about camera technique, angles you use, why you use them, camera style, camera movement. Well, one answer is that it depends on the type of film you're making. If you're telling a story that's told in an apartment house in New York, really not much point in trying to see how fancy you can get with film angles. If you're doing a picture such as this one, Bad Day at Black Rock, there's a wide opportunity to use what I'll call effective angles because everything you look at has interest. But now you get into the purpose of the film. The perfect camera technique is one the audience doesn't even know is existing. The whole idea is they become so engrossed in what's going on, they don't even know they're looking at a movie. It's happening. That on most films you try to do. Now, sure, sometimes it's, Western, for example. Western scenery is spectacular. Everybody watches a man ride a horse and enjoys it. So you do things that by themselves have visual interest. But mostly, you try to do it in a way that's so called for that you're not even aware of it. Now, this scene in which Tracy's talking to Bob Ryan by the gas station, we shoot up at Bob and down at Tracy. Well, it so happens that shooting up at Bob makes him menacing and interesting, and he and the gas pump, the sky and the mountains are a very effective angle. But the reason we shoot up at him is because Spence is sitting down, he's looking up at him.
What about Corregidor, the Death March?
And vice versa. We shoot down at Spence, the simple reason that Bob, who's 6'2", is looking down at Spence. So a lot of talk about angles reduces itself to your eye. You don't go out there with preconditioned notions of how you're going to set the camera for every scene. You watch the scene, and there's a place to see it. Anybody watching something will drift over to the place where you should see that scene. They'll do it. That's where you put the camera. Now, the other thing is you try to find the viewpoint that encompasses the whole scene, but do not put it right on your principal actors. Go past your principal actors at what's happening. Film is reactive. What counts is what your players react to. So if you go past your principal actors at what's happening, then you cut around, reverse, back on that actor. Automatically, you're in a close shot, which is what you want to be, and automatically you're cutting off what happened to see how it affected him. That's the name of the game in films. Hitchcock said it all. He said cunning means the ability to make an audience feel what you want them to feel by the reaction of somebody to something. He said I made a film called Rear Window, in which Jimmy Stewart, pinned down in a wheelchair, observes everything that counts out the window. He said, now, I could take a shot of Jimmy looking out the window, and he smiles. Okay, now I cut to a woman wheeling a baby along. Jimmy is a affectionate, warm person who smiles at this lovely scene of the little baby. Now I cut to a scene of a cop beating a fellow over the head with a club. Jimmy's a sadist. Whatever you show will relate to what Jimmy is by the virtue of the way he reacts to it. That's the way you make pictures. There's been a lot of comment on the photography in this picture. Well, of course, the man that should talk about that is the man who photographed it, Billy Miller. But since Billy's not here, I'll fill in for him. Part, of course, of the good photography is what you're photographing. Spectacular locations, spectacular faces, spectacular characters. A streamline in the desert is pretty spectacular. So you start with stuff that's worth seeing. If you saw it by being there, you'd be just as impressed as seeing it on the screen. But then there comes some of the techniques that are used to make films and to create the feeling in the audience that you want and the look of a film. Let's take a Western. If you're making a Western and you go out into the desert or the beautiful mountains or something, you're trying to tell a hard-bitten, gutty story of people who are at each other, life and death. You photograph it all front light, nice bright sunlight, flowers. Of course, you can take out the birds that are singing, nice clean clothes. They're going to look like a bunch of chorus boys. It's not going to look like a tough Western at all. Jack Ford, I guess the man who everyone agrees made the best Westerns, he shot a backlight. Backlight means the mountains are dark and heavy and ominous, that the faces of the characters are dark and they're line lit from the side. He used big things behind people and shot up at them to make them look menacing by taking on the character of the mountains behind them that were menacing. So you find yourself, if you're doing a film like Bad Day or similar drama, you find yourself shooting at least in crosslight where there are dark shadows and line lights, or even in backlight where things are heavy and tough. You key light faces in the way that there's shadows on their faces. You pick up their eyes. Notice in the film, for example, how Spence will drop the tip of his hat to cover his eyes. And then up come his eyes right into that key light. Well, that's deliberate. It's deliberate on Spence's part. It's deliberate on our part. If you stare at someone all the time, you lose the impact of what that look is. So you preserve it. You bring it on when you want it by turning into it, by, in the case of photography, by the way you light it. As I suppose everybody knows, films have to be photographed out of continuity. That is, you can't shoot them in the order in which they're going to happen on the screen. This is because, for instance, you have to go to a location, shoot the exteriors, come back to the studio, shoot the interiors. You couldn't make 15 trips back and forth. This together with actors and their availability and trying to do all their work at one time, and so on. Now, one of the jobs of directing a film, particularly when it's a exterior physical film, to use a phrase that implies complicated matches in scenes, photographically, wardrobe, and so on, is this continuity, this out-of-continuity. Most directors use a storyboard, in some cases a very elaborate one in which there are little sketches representing the shots they're going to make. I've never done that, but I would put the whole picture up around the walls of my office, each card representing a sequence or, in some cases, a single shot and where it fell into the whole fabric, so that you could sort of look at the thing and see the picture if you really wanted to look at it that way, or at least not stub your toe by forgetting how and what the scene meant in relation to the rest of the film and how it was going to be cut into it. That was certainly true of Bad Day at Black Rock. The interiors were built in the studio. It's often very convenient to work on interiors on location, but this film was made during July. It's hot up there, 110, and we weren't interested in the need for a cover set. We really didn't need one, so we built the sets in the studio and did them there. The time came when we shot the picture and put it together in the cutting room to discuss music. was a heavy group who thought it should be real, they said in quotes. Shouldn't be any music. Well, that's silly. Those are the same people who said, what are you going to do with Panavision when you have only one man in the desert? Every trick that will induce emotion in the audience, you use them all. And music properly done, apart from its virtues by itself in a musical, in what's called a score, is part of your bag of tools. Of course you have music. You gauge what you want to do with a picture according to what the picture is. Now, Andre and I discussed it, but it was apparent to both of us that it's not the kind of picture that you swamp with an hour of music. There were places where it meant something. We got out of the way where it didn't mean anything. But we didn't do what would be a silly thing to do, is say, make it real, have nothing but the sounds of the desert, opening and closing of doors. It's not real. It's a movie. It really comes down to the bottom line. The bottom line is cutting that film. The big trick in a movie is to create the illusion that it's happening. Make people forget that they're looking at a whole bunch of pieces of film. This is happening. So staging is preparation for cutting. You stage it in such a way that you can cut it. The final job is the way that film is put together. That is what makes the scene come alive. And you've got to do it in a way that people don't realize you're doing this. It's just happening. Now, the trick to cutting is like the trick to staging. It's reactive. Cary Grant used to tell me one time I was working as a cutter on Gunga Din. He said, let the other fella have all the jokes. I just want to be the fella that reacts to them. He knows exactly what he was talking about. So, cutting. I was lucky enough to understand cutting because I was a cutter. I started in the cutting room because the bottom, I was working my way up. Figured to me that was one of the ways to learn how to make films. So I swept floors, kept track of trims and outtakes, put them together in a machine, and eventually, 8 years later, I was a cutter. Bobby Wise, pretty well-known director, one of my oldest friends, was in the next cubicle. He started as a music cutter, among other things. So did I. I was a sound effects cutter, music cutter. And so, to reiterate, we learned the technique, and that is the literal word, the technique by which a motion picture is strung together to run on a screen in a darkened theater to make it happen. That's what cutting a picture is. And when you stage a film, if you're not staging it in such a way that it will cut effectively, you're not doing a very good job. Now, some directors just photograph everything from all directions. You're not going to get a look of a picture that amounts to anything, and you're not going to get the maximum output of that scene on an audience that way. So it boils down to, you've got these pieces of film. How do you assemble them back and forth, in and out, long shot, close up, intercut? I'll quote Hitchcock again. He said the name of making movies is Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. He's absolutely right. If you tell a story that's and then they, and then, and that, you're in big trouble. You want to have two things going. You reach the peak of one, you go to the other. You pick the other up just where you want it. When it loses interest, drop it. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. All these aspects are the actual final bottom line of every film, except a film whose real character is one of brilliance in dialogue and performance. Say, Philadelphia Story, a marvelous film. Now, that wasn't particularly noted for its cutting, though it was well cut. It was noted for its polished, witty lines, its performances. But let's take a picture like Great Escape. Now, you remember that because of the interplay between the characters, the menace, the look, the power of the setting. Those things are achieved by the way you cut the film, and I'm glad I spent those years in the cutting room. When I left Metro and became an independent, the one thing I took with me, the editor there, who was their top guy, and I tripled his salary, put him under contract, said, you'll never regret it. You gotta have these guys. Invaluable.